For more information on the Toronto Audio Engineering Society, go to torontoaes.org. There you will find notifications on our upcoming events, past events, Masters of Audio, and our member showcase. The Toronto AES is brought to you by Solotech, Gare Audio, Sonotechnique, Bell Media, YSL Pro, Lectrosonics Canada, BRTB, Global USS, Adamson, Lawo, avshop.ca, Q5X, and the executive team of the Toronto Audio Engineering Society.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Ross Whitney, and I'm the chair of the Toronto section of the Audio Engineering Society. It's my pleasure tonight to be joined by Colin Bernard of Lectrosonics Canada. And take it away, Colin.
Hi, everybody. So today's a refresher based on 5G having now deployed in many areas in Canada. So we want to try and remain as focused as we can. But a quick background for those that did not attend the AES meeting, the prior meeting, on some legalities as well, which is very important. But basically, I was invited to take part basically in a conference in 2013. This is how far this goes back. I was invited on behalf of the wireless industry of Canada, and there was another manufacturer out of the USA at the same conference. And the conference was stacked full with stakeholders. And it was quite apparent after day 2 of the meeting that we were the smallest companies in the room, and the real stakeholders were Microsoft and Google, and this was obviously arranged by Industry Canada. But it was at that stage that I realized we had a uphill battle in ahead of us in terms of making clear to the authorities on how important wireless microphones are for production. And it was an interesting couple days. So that was just an earlier slide. Most importantly now, mobile phones. In other words, we had an auction. The auction is over. The auction, in fact, was over in April 2019. And that's a very important facet which I need to enlarge upon from a legality standpoint. This is the actual repack status originally. It's a slide that was published basically for what the repack meant, and the repack combined with the auction meant that broadcasters had to repack their existing transmitters above 600 megahertz down into the beach real estate, for the sake of a better word, spectrum 470 to 608. Anything above 600 meg besides 2 little chunks was going to be taken away basically from us, and it was an uphill fight from then in terms of making clear again how important from a broadcaster standpoint, and the broadcasters were very much part of this process in terms of what it means to have production and clear production with no interference. That's besides all the other facets of the market that wireless microphones appear with, including house of worship, theater, and film video production, of course, as well. But this repacking was basically started in April 2017. That is done. All the repacking has happened. And we were then basically told very clearly that anybody who did not have a license for wireless microphones in Canada needed to vacate, and vacate after the auction was over. So that paragraph there, license exempt operation, is prohibited within the bands of 617 to 652 meg and 663 to 698 meg following the completion of the auction. The auction was completed in April 2019. Anyone who's in those bandwidths now, after that completion of auction, is illegal in terms of ISIDS laws, and the technical rules that cover that I included as a link for everybody there, so you could always just take a screenshot of that if you wanted to get into that in deep detail. So RSS 210 is more rules, which basically removed then officially those bands of 616 to 652 and 663 to 698 from wireless use for our use in Canada for what they call low power radio apparatus. And So that's the actual decision document as a reference. Some people in certain organizations have requested these links to show to management or to any authorities as to what the actual legalities are, which is quite clear now. And that's basically what ISS 210 covers. And wireless microphones were permitted to operate on a voluntarily licensed basis within the upper portion of 657 to 663. But that's a very, very small chunk, which we highly recommend not to use, given what I'll expand on further of how powerful 5G really is now once it's rolled out. It's much louder than we thought. So you're going to have carriers on either side of you, high power carriers, even if you did use that very small bandwidth, so very risky, we feel. I went to bat personally and ended up being the chairman actually of a radio advisory group that had to basically consult Industry Canada on those latest decisions, and the broadcasters were part of that team. And my approach there was that we should mirror as much as possible what happened in the USA in a similar manner with the auction down there. And there was a certain chunk of spectrum, which is 941 to 960 meg in the USA, that had been opened up for license-only operation. So I went to bat on that and said, if you're taking spectrum away, we need to also have some other options. And that resulted in a ruling, which is this license ruling CPC 2-1-11. And basically what that authorizes is anyone who does want to use the 941 to 960 for fixed operation. Portable is much more complicated because of licensing. But I mean, there are ways around this, but in my experience, it's not as easy but to plan. And it is another option. However, they made a caveat. And this bandwidth was opened only for broadcasters and other program producers, large venue operators and owners, professional sound companies, and theater, music, sporting venues, and other similar event organizations that require high-quality audio wireless microphones as part of their productions or events. Unfortunately, House of Worship was not included in that ruling. So House of Worship cannot apply for use in that bandwidth. Those were some other bandwidths that were under investigation, but that ended up really just being a document covering the 941 to 960. We have made and are in the USA selling a lot of 941 to 960 for ENG news type operators. New York, NBC, for instance, jumped on that in a big way, but their licensing regime is quite different, much more rigid, much more streamlined, and that's something I'm working on with ICE still to make this as streamlined as possible if and when we do need to deploy frequencies up there, but there are not too many frequencies necessarily available, and I'll get to that where 470 to 608 still has a lot of space. That's a scan we took last week, just to give you an indication of what that 941 to 960 bandwidth looks right now. That's taken from our office in Bloor Street, Bloor and Spadina. These are little STLs, which are studio to transmitter links. I think that's CHCH over there. But this was very busy at one stage. Even with Hydro was using this for certain applications. But from the repack, we find this is definitely cleaning up, and certainly something we'll be considering. For fixed installs, less frequencies, and if you're willing to go through the license regime process. So the repack we've covered, and that was done in the USA, the same time frame. Canada, Mexico, and the USA were all part of a tripartite agreement, and the FCC repacked the same way, those broadcaster transmitters having to move down, excuse me, into the 470 to 608. I must stress that our industry, as much as we tried, received zero compensation for this move. We had to, including the broadcasters, they had to, for a second time, gear up and spend big money to move those transmitters down or buy new transmitters, because the same thing happened with the 700 megahertz and up. But that's basically what happened with the broadcasters repacking down into that UHF bandwidth. So I'm not going to dwell too much on the repack anymore, but that's basically what we were left with. The green portion is 470 to 608. And the small little chunk I described earlier is what they call the duplex gap. And they are what they call white space devices, which is another technology entirely license-free, allowed to be in that bandwidth. So we stay very much away from those little chunks. And there's that smaller chunk I described earlier. I have a better shot of that. And keeping in mind, you've got now downlinks, mobile downlinks like 5G right on top of you here. So again, as a professional, I do not advise using this chunk in any particular manner for serious wireless operation use. And as more of these 5G transmitters deploy, the more we will be able to measure this. But this was a similar situation in the USA, so above 600 meg, which is all, unfortunately, we were left with. So there are fines. This is a USA slide. I'm not trying to scare people, but this is certainly a slide that is circulating in the US for illegal wireless mic operation. Haven't seen a similar slide in Canada, but you do have to be aware in that bandwidth, certainly in Toronto, given that this is a Toronto chapter meeting, in the upper 600 meg, roughly about 657 or that sort of area, you run a strong risk now of interfering with Toronto Fire, and that's not something you want to be caught doing at all. So it is a reality now that we have to deal with, but equipment has changed quite dramatically. But this is really the beach real estate, for the sake of a better word. And we have to work with it, and there are certainly ways to do this. Technologies have moved to wider band, full digital, 24-bit, 48K, for instance. And there's certainly enough channel count in that respect. Most importantly is frequency band planning now. This is something that is going to become more and more prevalent. Those days of just sort of rock and roll and firing up and then trying to just find a clear frequency at the particular event or that particular venue is gone. It's just simply under these scenarios where you have less real estate and more population within that spectrum. It takes a lot of planning. It's just homework, but needs to be done, or their coordinators that do this. But that's an example of a frequency band planning plot where VHF is not going away. So there is some sort of intercom that do use VHF as primary frequencies and are still attractive. For that, walkies is a very important subject that I'm going to discuss, because these are now digital, high power, and they're everywhere. Certainly in terms of COVID and the security and all the added measures that have had to be taken on film sets, theaters, etc. There's more walkies than ever now. But here's an example where, again, in 470, say, depending on your location, you could populate your wireless mics there. You could have some wireless intercom, IFB and IEM. Again, look at the spacing, space it away as a separate system from 495, move up to 512, for instance. And then again, space it again and keep these as integral systems within the total bandwidth. That's what band planning really is, and frequency coordinated, obviously. We'll get into that more. So 565 to 608, again, could be a prime area for some wireless mics. We're not using the 902 to 928. That's something that, there's just too much up there in terms of consumer type related audio. And then there's that bandwidth, which is ENG, for instance, NBC, I mentioned 941 to 960. These are intercom, and that's good news. So a lot of the intercom manufacturers moved out of the UHF spectrum, so freeing up some of that 470 to 608 for us, which is good news. So all is not lost. But this is an example also of the migration of analog versus digital modulation, which is the transmitters now that we have to contend with. Prior to the digital rollout, which is what they call the DTV transmission of TV, this was an example of an analog carrier. And you can see we had some room where we used to put wireless microphones on either side of this carrier. Those days are gone now. This is now a digital modulation, and that whole TV channel is fully occupied. So that creates a need for much more coordination. And if this is on top of you, depending on how far away you are from that transmitter, you're certainly going to have interference. Most importantly, interference too in that illegal bandwidth, given the I'll show you that with 5G as well, but that's a TV example. Here's a scan that we did again recently. This was Kipling and Queensway, which is a very, very busy area of Toronto. There's a lot of film production in that area. And so this is a macro type view outdoor. There's that beach real estate again, 470 to 608. And you can see those chunks that we basically left with in that area. There's a little chunk there. You can see a little bit there. This is an interesting portion here. And all of these are split into TV channels, TV designated numbers, TV channel 33 or 34, etc. I'll show you that. This is very important. Look at the public service usage now that is below 470 in that area. That it was extremely loud. You can see the attenuation here measured in dBm. So these are all interfering signals. These are the areas or little pockets where we are working now. And then is 5G. And you can see how close that is relatively. This channel here is a no-go channel. This is channel 37, which is the astronomy or the UFO channel, you may want to call it. If we're talking to somebody out there, that's where we'd be doing it. So that's an absolute no-go. In fact, our equipment, you cannot even scroll into that area at all because it's highly illegal. So most of the pro manufacturers that I am aware of, you cannot even scroll into that bandwidth. If you have any prosumer type equipment, it's called TV channel 37, that can scroll in there, you do so entirely at your own risk. That's highly, highly illegal. It's called radio astronomy, and that's the same reservation in the USA. Look at the cellular now, that's coming up too, especially in that area. Most importantly, these 5G antennas are also much closer in proximity, installed everywhere. So that's a nice slide that actually I chatted to Ike Zimbel. Everybody knows Ike as a RF coordinator and very experienced in large scale events. And this is a scan he basically took quite recently, but this was dated, so this was September, again, Bloor Street, which is near our offices too. And that's an example, or typical example now. That is Rogers. That's the Rogers 5G channel. And that's a good shot of how strong that is. If you look at those peaks, again, this is in dBm. So if, what to do sometimes, there are some remedies and not expensive. This is for a couple $100. We have these passive filters that we're going to be using more and more often. They're about 25 meg wide. So we can just isolate ourselves away from that adjacent high noise channel in a very simple way and just connect a couple of these in and designate it as a certain bandwidth of 25 meg, for instance. Passive, and the word passive is going to become way more prevalent in everything we do in terms of RF more and more. But here's a very reasonable passive solution, and not going to break the bank at all. So you just insert those in line on the, or actually at the receiver end themselves. So something to consider if you've got those carriers close by. But that's just a quick baseline then of those TV channel numbers I was talking about, and effectively what designates a TV channel number and what bandwidth. So TV channel, as I said, 33 or 34. That small area we saw on that other slide was sort of in this sort of area. And other areas that are interesting is in Toronto for that, that is pretty good, is 512. This area here, it was that on that other slide that I showed, was fairly open. And I'll show that in more detail on another slide with Toronto actual TV channels. But when we call it a TV channel designation, that's what it is, and that's the bandwidth it occupies. So there's an example of Toronto. There's another slide I'll show you, which is basically this said the future, but this is the now. So these were the current DTV channels that we had to contend with in Toronto prior to the auction. Those had to repack into that 470 bandwidth. VHF was hardly affected, as you can see, but that UHF of 470 to 608 kicks off around about here. And you can see it kind of left us with a little, certainly less space in this area, because that's where some of those DTVs, quite a few of them, repacked into. So that real estate changed quite considerably there. This was kind of unchanged, which is good, which is that 512, somewhere around there that I mentioned. And there's each one of these white spaces is 6 megahertz. And so in terms of present technologies, 9 or 10 frequencies, very attainable conservatively. And depending on modes, we have an HD mode, some manufacturers called high density mode, where you could get more frequencies, etc. So there's still quite a bit of space here. And so that's the TV channel 37, that's the no-go. This is the actual no-go area now that was auctioned off entirely. So that is now gone and illegal. So a better shot of that. You can see that this probably gives it more graphically in terms of exactly what that means. That block 20 in our terms kicks off at 512, and it goes all the way to 536, for instance, which is TV channel 24. So you can see that correlates, there but bandwidths have increased. So we have wider band transmitters now, transmitters that actually can scroll in the A1, or what we call B1 band. So that would cover the A1, covers that portion of real estate, the B1. However, the full digital transmitters can cover the whole bandwidth now. And that's something that we need to focus on, which makes life much easier, as well as the receivers, of course. Latency is still a very important facet to consider, especially with full digital systems. Older digital systems are 2.9 but some are like 18 milliseconds, which is way, way unusable for pro use. Digital hybrid, that's an electro designation, 2.9, very workable. Newer digital, we one of the lowest. Our Duet IFB full digital 470 to 608 totally wideband, which actually CBC standardized upon now, is as low as 1.4. But you've got to keep in mind the round trip of calculation for latency, depending if you're using a full digital console, etc. So that's that careful management. That's you need to factor those factors in of the round trip, including your Dante network too, obviously. But still very workable. That's that equipment I mentioned that is now fully wideband, full digital. And most importantly, in this particular product, which is why CBC looked at it, we're using half the number of RF carriers. So that's a very important facet. So we can run 4 mono or 2 stereo in half rack with only 2 carriers. So one carrier would be stereo, the second stereo channel would be another carrier, or we could run dual mono, so 4 mono IFBs. And that can scroll anywhere in that 470 to 608 bandwidth. And most importantly, this also has a scanner on it. And it would look something like that, doing a scan from 470 to 608 on the pack itself. And you could just simply then select the frequency for that IFB automatically. But this is the kind of equipment that's going to become much more prevalent. Or I could sync this to the IFB transmitter, for instance. And other wireless equipment, which is now going to be totally wideband, again, 470 to 608, does include the body packs, does include the handhelds. So that's that whole real estate beat spectrum that you can scroll through, which makes life, including Dante, much, much easier. That's the rear panel of those two units, the transmitter and the receiver, both with Dante. And again, at that very low latency. But that's the kind of equipment that's going to become way more prevalent. Smaller packs, fixed antennas. We'll get into all those sort of facets. But these are the rules for them for wireless headache free. 48 channels is a standard on Broadway now. So that's in the new beach spectrum we get in 48 channels. So it is attainable. And that's a tour that went out right across the USA, again, in this new bandwidth, however, it's highly frequency coordinated. And there's very, very important tools to do that, scanning tools as well. Frequency coordination. This is just an absolute must now. What we could get away with in prior situations where you would just arrive at a gig and power up and then hope for the best, that is going to become much, much less a situation given the bandwidth, and you saw the spectrum there, certainly in the major urban areas. So frequency coordination, a lot of you are familiar with that already, third order or second or third order. Third order is the minimum calculation you need to calculate a system that's going to be stable. And again, there are coordinators that do this professionally, depending on the size of the gig. Something like a Super Bowl, for instance, you can imagine how much coordination. But there is tools available, and some very good. We have our own frequency coordination tool, which I'll show you, which is software-based and scanning-based, called Wireless Designer. But there is a program called IAS, which we use. It's not ours. It's actually made by Professional Wireless Systems. And I know IKE has used this on more than one occasion in the trenches and on tours. So you can import the IAS results into a program like ours or other manufacturers, which is very useful. And that's what IAS looks like. Basically, you would plot what TV channels you have to contend with in that environment and where they are. And then you would start telling that program where you are, telling them what the frequency coordination parameters are as well. And then it'll plot your system. The yellow lines here that you can see it's plotted are basically the no-go areas, and those are channels it has calculated as usable. This is a neat little tool to have, and it's not expensive, RF Explorer. It's something definitely to consider to measure those out-of-band signals that we definitely have to contend with sometimes. So something you could, and now you can import the scan into a program like Wireless Designer, which is very useful if you wanted to. So that'll give you a snapshot of the whole bandwidth, not just the 470 to 608. So these are the kind of tools this is used on film sets all the time. Now, you can imagine this level of production that we've been involved with. It's not just wireless mics that get coordinated. We actually won an Emmy Award for our digital hybrid technology and how it performs in those environments. But, the wider band transmitters, again, extremely important. So you can also have onboard recording now if necessary for certain applications if you really want to be fail-safe and put it into record mode. So the tools are there. I think what we should do now really is scroll through an example And it's a slide I'd like to come back to and that's a good one. So if you look at that, that's again a scan done indoor in that same location in the Kipling area. And it's just a better graphical. This is indoor, so we're getting about minus 10 dB attenuation in that building, and so it shows exactly where those offending transmitters are now, and they're not offending; they just would offend with us, right? But that's a sort of a graphical area more of the space at Kipling, for instance, in that mode. So what we could show you here now is an actual tool. And you can see the wireless designer there, Russ?
Yes.
Good. So here's an example of a scanning tool now that it is very, very important. And it's going to scan from that 470. This is our software, but other manufacturers have software that's similar to this. So what you basically would do when you arrive at the venue, this is connected via USB, or you could be networked. It could be remote, in other words, is simply, and now it's the most accurate scan you would get because it's using the actual antennas from the receiver itself. So it's exactly what the wireless receiver is seeing that this is scanning to find workable space within the new beach real estate, right? So it's looking for the optimal areas, and it's going to make life very simple and quick and easy. So with one click, I'll start the actual scan. And this is now scanning again from 470, and it's going to scan all the way up to 608. So that's one, in this case, this is a 4-channel receiver that we're using, and it's 4-channel half rack. I showed you that earlier. And we'll just wait for it to scan through, and it's showing exactly what the noise levels are. And this is in my office on my desk at Bloor and Spadina. And there's a small window that faces west, and the other main window faces south. So this is the view you're seeing then basically from this location, if you were doing a quick install or a gig or setting up a show. And you can see these areas here are the areas it's going to sort of populate us in. And I just simply stop that, export it to the frequency calculator, the frequency calculation tool, get into frequency coordination, and you can see the frequencies it's chosen. But those were frequencies I chose myself earlier, where the nice part about this program is that I can actually scroll into, that's a locked channel, but I can actually scroll these. Like worst case, if I was getting hit, I can actually physically scroll these into an open area, and you can see it's calculating those IM calculations that we showed you earlier. And doing quite similar to what IAS would be doing, but actually doing it physically, that we can just simply deploy that. But here in this mode, I'm going to ask it to coordinate again. Most importantly here, this is very, very important, is walkies. So the walkies, this receiver is scanning from 470 to 608, but the walkie-talkies that now are very prevalent, as I said, on most of the gigs, and certainly anything from a professional nature or digital, they're higher power, and they occupy this bandwidth here too. A lot of them are very close to that 470. So this software can now take these frequencies, what we call custom channels. We can input those. I inputted those myself. I inputted a 450 as a walkie, and I inputted a 469 for 0.450 to be as close as I could to 470, right? Just to show you of how that walkie could be interfering in our mix, in our recipe, in our soup, So when you do enter a custom channel, and that could be, for instance, it could be a couple Shure handhelds, for instance, that are in the room, that have always been in that room and have been working just fine, and those frequencies have never been interfered with. And the A1 just says, hey, listen, don't touch those. Those are great. So no problem. You enter that one as 501.2. They've always used it in the venue. And it comes in as channel locked. So these are not going to change. because they locked, right? And then I inputted another channel there, for instance, which I locked, which could be one of our channels or something else entirely. That could be an IFB, for instance, that you know, or something to do with comms that has been good and you don't want to change. So what I'm looking for in a 4-channel receiver now that I'm connected to the software is 4 clear channels. And I just hit coordinate, and you'll see where it's populated me, which is quite interesting. I mean, so this is where the receiver feels from a selectivity standpoint it wants to be. However, you can still scroll these and you can see the red markers coming up. That's a no-go. But if I move that ever so slightly somewhere else, like how about there? There's a kind of low noise there, right? And do that sort of thing. And then basically deploy would be the rocket launch. That would deploy those in real time to the receiver. And then you simply just IR sync your transmitters to these freaks and you're good to go. It really is that easy. So the custom channel is an important thing, and it's just a simple matter of adding a frequency in there. It comes in as locked, and you're ready to go, and then do your scan or rescan if necessary with those channels locked, and it'll recalculate. That's just another view. But if we get into, so in this case, I'm going to discard the changes, go back to that scan, but I could be doing another gig the same day and move into a different part of town. I just would clear that simply and then start another scan. It really is just that simple. We've tried to make this as few clicks as possible. So anybody could really do this with a bit of practice. And as I said, there are other manufacturers that have software to assist, obviously, in that regard too. So I just wanted to show something here. Another way of entering those custom channels is or custom bandwidths. So get back to the band planning now. This is, again, something I have to stress. Think band planning. So I want my IEM system now to be in one of those gaps that I showed you guys earlier, right, from the scans. And another nice way of doing that before you even scan is tell this receiver what you want to scan. And in that case here, we could enter a bandwidth, which I mentioned that 512, for instance. I could just simply go in here and input 512 to, what's that band? Let's see, block 20, 512 to 536. I would just simply enter that here into the custom range, right? So that when I do my scan, the scan will only scan that select bandwidth that I've entered in there, which makes life very easy too for certain. So that's with the band plan, and that's very important for IEM. So with IEMs, that certainly would be the first thing you would do. And it's just a simple matter of going in here and kick off with that first freak, 512. And we're going to put it 512, we set to 536, right? And that could be labeled then as IEM, but all my IEMs then would then be in that bandwidth and separated from your wireless mic channels, separated from your comm system, separated from the walkie-talkies. So that's the idea. So I could simply, once I've done that, I could go to frequency scan and, well, first apply changes. And when I scan, it would only scan that particular bandwidth that we've asked for. So these are just some of the prevalent things to see that all is not lost with the tools and the sophistication of these tools and the simplicity of these tools, most importantly. That's what we've strived for, is the simplicity to be able to get someone up and going very, very quickly. There's a bunch of other sort of features here. For instance, you could generate a report of that. Say it is a church, for instance. You could say, okay, we did a scan on X date at X time, and those were the frequencies that we came up with for the equipment we're using, and just, file a report and if anything changes in 6 months time, somebody changed a freak, simply go back to your report and sure enough, someone's changed a frequency, and you can go back to the grid of where you should be etc. Importing scan data is going to become much more important. Remember that little RF Explorer scanner that I showed? If you were scanning from that, you could import that data, so import scan data and into this grid and then do a scan and overlay. Those scans could be overlaid too, right? So very important that the scanning facet of things is easier, but certainly if you're touring, you would then be importing scans maybe. So you're going to Calgary next, you could have a scan that already had been done, not necessarily with our equipment. It could have been a scan done by somebody else as long as it's compatible in terms of file transfers and stuff. You could just simply import that and say, hey, I'm going to Calgary. Why don't I import the Calgary scan in there before I get there? And then the Calgary scan would be imported in here on your laptop. You could be on the bus. You could be calculating frequencies for Calgary before you even get there, or you're sitting in the airport, for instance, stuff like that. So that's the workflow. I'm just seeing if there was anything else we've done. Yeah, you could export the scan data too. All of this could be exported to those custom channels to a file. So say you wanted all your guitars for some reason in a certain band with, again, band planets. So make sure all the guitars are together away from the IEM again. Space it away. But that could be a file simply that you just retrieve. We could have a bunch of different files that you could just simply open and import those custom channels that you know you don't ever want changed from a file, or those Calgary channels that you know are existing in that stadium or in that theater or in that conference room, and just import those into the scan and then rescan when you get there, stuff like that. What can we do besides scanning, besides tools? Best practices is the most important thing. You'll start hearing more and more. We need to have the best practices those days of just running out an antenna, running it out with any cable, not knowing the loss ratio on the cable, not knowing whether the antenna is passive or has active gain, running a booster that you've always run for years on your shorter cable that's worked just purely because we don't have that much spectrum interference, or you didn't have much spectrum interference. And so the booster was boosting low noise, but now the booster is going to boost the 5G signal maybe that's in your, or not necessarily exactly close to you, but the whole noise floor is increasing. Cellular, walkie, all those things. So most important now is to think more passive. Passive is and less boosting. Boosting is going to do entirely the wrong thing. You now desensitizing your receiver, overloading the receiver input basically, and it's just confusing the receiver entirely, and that's when the problems start. Actually, Ike Zimbel is writing an article on this as we speak, which is going to be published in ProSound or ProSound News, and it's going to be titled One to Look Out For. It's The RF Game Has Changed. That's a very important article which will cover in depth what I'm going to be covering right now, but we're going to whiz some through these scenarios. RF cable loss, again, good quality cable. The most important thing to remember is you don't want to overload the RF input stage of the receiver. So the calculation of cable versus splitter loss so that you end up at unity gain at the receiver is your goal, always, period. You never want to be going in +4 or something to that effect. In fact, attenuation now is becoming more prevalent. We have antennas that we can actually attenuate, and they're called ALP690s at -4, and bring down again the noise floor as to what the receiver's seeing. So very important to remember. That's just a calculation of what splitter loss is and how much loss you would get on passive filters in that respect, and those have to be calculated into your loss calculations. Again, the goal is to end up at unity, so you can do that quite simply on a piece of paper, working from the antenna first and what type of antenna, etc. Antenna cables, very, very important. But there's also just a quick example of it's from that wireless designer of what a rack looks like with the antennas that are on the rack itself. Not good. Remote your antennas, much better. Again, small best practices that are going to become way more prevalent. You may have a situation in your venue now where you have started to get more noise just because of the deployment of everything. So these are some of the things to look for. Are your antennas in the rack? Get them out, remote them, and again, keep your antenna cables short. Don't boost. Come up with a passive antenna if necessary. RG8, as you can see, is pretty low. So 58, not. Anybody that's running RG58 on a system right now is bound to have problems. Look at the loss ratio. It's just not a good cable, and it's not something that's going to, you don't even want to go there in 174, but LMR is a good manufacturer of low loss cable as well. And they have the LMR 400 or the 240, and we make, we sell the Belden cable, which is these designations. And again, low loss is your friend, high quality. That's over 100 feet. You can see you're losing very little there relatively. Transmitter order, gain at the transmitter, still very important. Your gain settings, make sure that you're modulating fully and that transmitter is modulating fully so that when it hits the receiver, it's good clean signal and not half a pipe of signal hitting the receiver. Again, let the receiver do the heavy lifting now is the most important thing. Receiver to selectivity. But again, it's only as good as the best practices of the signal before it actually hits that receiver input chain. Antenna placement, absolutely critical now. A line of sight, obviously. 10-foot height, we find is a good rule of thumb. And again, these are paddles. I was always taught to spread your antenna as if you can, and just maximize your diversity reception then of your receiver, which needs to see some nice switching. You don't want to see a receiver hugging the A or the B side. And if it does, that's something to look at and see, well, do I not have equal length cables on either side, etc. Those sort of things. Is the cable not a good cable? Is it not a low loss cable? etc. etc. So these are simple practices that can be put into place and at very little cost. That's a no-no. You got the transmitter right against the skin. I mean, that's just an absolute no-no. And we see it time and time again. The body absorbs a lot of RF and you're going to have problems. That may have worked for you in the past. In a high dense RF environment now, that's not going to work for you because again, the receiver's just going to be compromised, So these are just the small things to look for that you may have been doing for years. So here's a good scenario where on a lot of Broadway shows, they mount the transmitters actually on the rear of the back, and then your antennas and the performers are facing the audience, right? So that's a good position if it's in a theater mode. So the performers are dancing and all the and facing the theaters here, the seats, etc. Your antennas could be mounted on the pros on either side, and that's a nice, good, clear line of sight to the antennas. Just basically by replacing the lav pack, you might find that will clean things up. And the same thing for a handheld. I mean, you can see the radiation pattern and how that differs between a handheld and a lav mounted on the rear, etc. Almost like a cardioid pattern of a mic almost.
Yeah, it looks like microphone pickup patterns.
Yeah, it's certainly something to keep in mind. So again, those cable placements, cable quality, antenna placement, the type of antenna. Most high quality antennas, passive antennas, still have gain. They still have 6 dB of passive gain. So again, if you're doing that calculation down the line where you're going to end up at unity, why would you? So you've got 6 dB there. You may have a splitter in line, so you're losing about 3, and then again, you calculate the loss of your cable. But if you're ending up at say +4 or +8 or something crazy, because you're boosting at the receiver, it's just not gonna fly anymore. So again, rather than work with a passive antenna as opposed to a helical like this is used in many applications. I'm sure you all recognize it. And that's got about 9 dB of passive gains, more than enough, again, if it's used correctly and placed in the right location. That's basically what a whoop antenna is. I mean, what unity gain basically is, and what you're trying to emulate is a couple whoop antennas on a receiver and put that on a stage. And that's more than ideal in certain applications. You've got no cable, you've got the whoop antenna right on the receiver itself, and the performers are 10, 15 feet away. You know, why create problems that's in that respect? So that would work just fine too. This is a very popular ground play dipole antenna that we use all the time. We've used these in studios, TVO, TFO, many theater installs, and again, it just has a maximum sensitivity. You can actually, and it's passive, entirely passive. They're about $90 each. So this kind of tool is not an expensive way to go. You're cutting down the amount of cable you need necessarily, run with shorter cables. And if it's positioned correctly, you can see the patterns. That's your maximum sensitivity. You can actually even adjust these for a certain bandwidth, again, if you were band planning. Very, very useful and inexpensive. There's your log periodic, or shark fin as we call it. And that's passive. It's got 7 dB of passive gain already. Yagis, which is this one, are used, that's more for very low, well, that's more like a supercard or shotgun, for the sake of a better description, where you really want to have that targeted towards a specific area only. That's used in certain broadcast type applications, certainly not in the kind of work we do generally. And but you can see there's no boosters here. There's that helical, which is interesting pattern. Again, one of the Broadway shows I was involved with was a Cirque du Soleil show that went to Broadway called Paramour, and I actually went to the theater on Broadway. It was, Broadway, as you can imagine, very, very busy area. And actually they had these helicals at the rear of the stage facing towards the audience. And then all the performers had their packs mounted onto in the small of the back. And that just gave more than enough coverage, in that respect with no boosters. So a bit of Q&A.
Great presentation. Really appreciate your sharing your experience and your knowledge with us. The first question that comes to mind for me is, how did you get to where you are? What did you study? Where did you study?
It goes all the way back to South Africa, and I was born in Johannesburg. I went, in those days, the army was compulsory, so you had to go to the army. And so I was in the army for 2 years, came out of the army in 1980, and a friend, serendipity, I guess, a friend of the family knew a company. I was 18 at the time, a lover of music. I played drums. And they said, well, we have a position for an apprentice, and it was an electronic component company that had a bunch of different agencies, basically. And one of the lines they had, funny enough, was Sennheiser. And of course, being a musician, and that attracted my attention immediately.
Where's the 421s?
Exactly. And I stuck with them, was trained. I went to Europe on my first training to Germany. I was very, very fortunate at 19 to their seminars and events. And ultimately at that stage, I then concentrated so much on that niche that it actually ended up, we formed with me as a director, Sennheiser Canada. So out of all the lines they had, there was 40 lines. I stuck to that one line and it grew. And so we started Sennheiser. South Africa was the first company to use the Sennheiser name. Actually, it wasn't owned by them, and that was in 1985. And South Africa was going through some very trying times. So I then moved with a job offer, very fortunate to get a job offer, because I was traveling to Europe twice, 3 times a year from the Canadian Sennheiser distributor in those days, TC Electronic in Montreal. And that's how I arrived in Canada. I was very, very fortunate. So those 421s got me all the way to Montreal. I ran the pro division for Montreal for quite some time. And then an opportunity came up in 2006 to start a new venture with Lectrosonics Canada. But I had already moved from Montreal in 1992 to Toronto because of the advent of theaters. So that was the first show I was heavily involved in, with that frequency coordination, of course, and all the other facets we've been through, called Phantom of the Opera. So that was my the theater debut. And then theater just took off in Toronto, as you know, in such a it really did. So I stayed in Toronto, but we moved over to Lectrosonics, which was a very enticing opportunity to have an RF shop set up, which I felt was very necessary given the way the spectrum is going to change out of downtown Toronto, situated near all the theaters and the broadcasters, of course, but no 421s, but lots of other great gear.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to hide a 421 in someone's hair. That's absolutely. I know where our kinship comes from now because I've been a bass player for many, many years.
Oh,
and
nice.
And my experience with wireless equipment is more on the, I guess we'd say the semi-pro end of things. Mm-hmm. Before we first met, I had a look at the specifications for the wireless receiver and transmitter that I have that I use with my bass rig, and it runs in the 2.4 gigahertz band. So up there with Wi-Fi.
It could, exactly. It's up there with Wi-Fi. Again, you could be lucky. It just depends. Wi-Fi, as you know, is increasing coverage too. So 2.4 is not the ideal. We decided, Lectrosonics that is, as a company, not to manufacture anything in 2.4 because of that reason. But there are manufacturers that still do it. And again, depending on the receiver selectivity, it may be okay in certain, until you start adding more channels, and then it becomes very constricting in terms of channel count. Mm-hmm. But are you having a problem right now? Probably not.
No, and I think there's a lot of movement to 5 gigahertz, which helps as well. Yes. I mean, 2.4 is congested for sure, but I don't think it's going to get any worse, and maybe it will get a little better. But it amazes me, like the spec is that, as long as you are less than 100 meters from the receiver.
Meters or feet?
Meters, 300 feet is what the manual says anyway.
Okay.
And this transmitter has a 10 milliwatt output. It runs on 2 AA batteries. It boggles the mind.
No. And again, it's obviously the receiver selectivity that's good in that respect. And as I say, channel counts, it's only one channel in that respect. However, the 2.4 bandwidth hasn't been good of late, especially in Toronto, because, as you say, it's become so congested for a lot of comm systems. I won't mention the manufacturers' names that definitely have moved away from 2.4 to 5 or to DECT. There's some very high quality systems that use a combination of VHF transmit and UHF receive.
Okay.
So it's a mix of, but 2.4 is you certainly don't see 2.4 in any broadcast theater type scenarios.
Or
TV studios, but native for years made a wireless VHF, which a lot of performers used. Again, the point is, Ross, all of these were okay up until a point where the spectrum noise was less And now, unfortunately, and I covers that extensively in his article, it's just not the same game anymore in that respect. So
with the advent of 5G among
everything else, and you can see cellular, the whole noise floor is, and the scary thing with 5G, and I mean, I don't mean that it's, we're not trying to scare people either, but it's much closer, the antenna placement. So in order for them to get coverage or good coverage on these mobile phones, and now a lot of these antennas are now being placed all over Toronto, in the major cities in Canada. However, they're in much closer proximity. So more antennas in closer proximity to the performance or where you are in that respect. Now, again, that's where the receiver selectivity is going to be extremely important. And filtering. So, and attenuation. I mean, that's essentially the three buzzwords that are going to be very, and band planning, of course, but band planning, passive antennas, antenna placement, all those facets that I mentioned are going to become way more important when you've got a 5G that's much closer to you to contend with, is the point, and frequency coordination. But that's what that wireless designer tool or other manufacturers have these tools now to do the heavy lifting. Certainly when you have channel counts of 30, 40, 50, 60 is quite common now on an average high-end production, you know.
Sure, regardless of if it's theater or if it's live music.
And yeah, everyone wants more. You know, more. Everyone wants a wireless comm now. Everybody wants an IFB. Yeah. So it's really just being smart, using the right tools. Obviously, a certain level of sophistication of equipment is important now, and channel count and planning. So again, if you know where you're going, you know the environment of where you're going. I mean, there's many ways of obviating some of those headaches with this kind of software on the tour bus before you even hit the city or remotely. And what we're finding now too is a lot of people are, you know, we're all in the same RF boat here. So a lot of manufacturers are sharing as much. We're all trying to make this. We were all part of this auction that unfortunately, and we're not compensated for it. So as an industry, I'm noticing that people are working far closer, which is good. And at the same time, people are sharing scans. For instance, there's certain websites now that I don't have those links. I should have back in always, if somebody gets hold of me, get hold of that website where you could, have a scan of Atlanta. It's somebody that may have been there a week ago, and just simply take that scan and import it into your software so that you're well ahead of the game before you hit the venue on the tour, and stuff like that.
And it's important for the data to be recent as well, because I imagine the situation is fluid.
Not really. I mean, we know who the fixed channels are in those stadiums. However, not always, because the situations, and I know John Christie, who's a very in the trenches coordinator as well. I mean, there's certain situations where you 10 minutes before showtime, always somebody arrives on set that shouldn't be there, and it happens, or there just happened to be a comm system within that venue that they didn't tell you about, and oh no, well we didn't. So oh yeah, well by the way, that's where you need to have the enough spare channels. Spares are very, very important when you're doing your calculations and your frequency coordinations. Simply just have enough spare frequencies, and on your belts, and again, it's easy to really move quite quickly if those are pre-coordinated. So we've got to start thinking more of just prior planning, end up with frequency coordinated frequencies, and use the software that's out there.
We've come a long way from the days where a live performer's biggest problem was a cab driver coming through the PA system.
Well, fortunately, the cabs are down in that VHF area. But certainly on Phantom of the Opera, I was at one stage. I wondered if they would all arrive outside, but it's funny on that show, and that was just a very good example of cable quality, where I ended up actually going. Funny you mentioned taxi. I ended up going with it was downtown Toronto, it was the Elgin Theatre, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, with Phantom, ran there for many years. But again, needed high quality antenna cables, and I had these big Amphenol military connectors. That's a big thing, connectors. A bum connector could create havoc. Make sure your connectors are high quality. Make sure that your terminations to those connectors now are solid. Very simple things that people can check. But it just so happened it was an Amphenol connector. The only way that could be crimped, because my cables in those days was 1989, was so thick to get the right attenuation, etc. And I had to go to the only company in town that could crimp those military connectors onto that cable was a taxi company on Adelaide. It saved the day.
Wow.
Because they did that all the time for their VHF.
Wow. So how did you discover that? How did you track them down as a solution to the problem?
It took a lot of... Who's going to have a cable the same size? Those are the only folks that were using that level of connector, really. You know, those big connectors they used to connect to their CB type radio. You know, It's a big, fat, but very specific tool. But yeah, the cables today it's like loudspeakers. If you're buying a pro loudspeaker, very hard to go wrong in certain cases if it's set up right. Again,
standardized.
Yeah, just stick with the pro names, and any one of those manufacturers is going to recommend high quality cable. Yeah, so many choices, but make sure you stick with those basics, which save the day or can cause a not too good a day.
What was the Neil Muncy quote about a cable is used to connect one potential source of trouble to another potential source of trouble? I like that one.
I always remember that presentation. Years ago, I was on the AES committee, I think I told you. And in those days, I never forget, it was an excellent presentation by Phil Giddings on grounding. I don't know if you remember that, but that's stuck with me for basic pin one.
You mentioned just briefly houses of worship, and they were sort of bypassed in many of the government discussions. What sort of solutions can, let's say, a simple traditional church where there's one speaker, maybe two people with wireless microphones? Sort of solutions can they use? Stay within the law and maybe not break the bank either.
Oh no, there's plenty of solutions. I mean, they were not bypassed. They were only bypassed on that 941 to 960, which was reserved specifically for high-end productions. People that basically need so many channels that they could use a few more in that 941 or 5 more, etc. Which is there's more than enough space in the 470 to 608 bandwidth in terms of some of the prosumer type equipment. Again, stick with well-known manufacturers that have done the heavy lifting, and quite simply just work according to your area. Just do the homework. There's always an Industry Canada office. If you're out in Whitby, or if you're out in Kitchener, there's always an Industry Canada office, local office at worst case, that you could consult and say, what are the TV channels I need to... They won't tell exactly the TV channels, but these are all things, if you do the right digging, that you can find out. If you are, for instance, in Kitchener, what TV channel number, which I showed you earlier, is, and what does that represent in frequency, does CHCH transmit on? And just simply then buy the equipment that can scroll at least away from that and still have some, and not be necessarily maybe too wideband. Again, if you're not spending that much money, you want to go maybe a little more selectively and not as wideband, depending on the price point. It's the old thing. I mean, you pay for what you get, in that respect. But it's receiver selectivity again. The less power maybe these days is as you say, your 10 milliwatt transmitter hasn't failed you, and in that respect, so don't overboost and don't, the days of going, oh, let's crank the gain up on my transmitter, and I'm going to and I'll shove in a booster now as well. Now I'm going to really sort of, hit the receiver, and the receiver's going, help. and so if you've already got in that area, and try and work, and they are expertise. The dealers certainly have them. Rental houses certainly know what is available and works in those areas, or what had worked. That's we're in a transition. What had worked before may not always be the solution moving forward.
And it's not just the television broadcasters, but the emergency services as well that you have to stay away from.
Those are far away from us. The point I'm making is if you are above 608, and that's where the 5G is deployed, and I showed you, attenuation levels and how strong the signals are, you are illegal. Simple as that. It's and so you're going to be interfered with by one of those 5Gs, more than likely. Or again, are we going to see spurious noise because of the power and the proximity of those 5Gs that we don't know? We're learning more and more about how loud the 5G channels are. Ideally, they shouldn't, again, if they are to spec, but everything's quantitative. And now you've got a walkie on site, right? That was not pre-coordinated into your frequency calculations. So you've got a rogue transmitter now on your set, etc. It's everything's quantitative. As the noise level increases, the receiver just is less and less sensitive. So it's those best practices, which I covers in that article, that is going to become the new game. And
definitely look forward to seeing that.
Yeah.
We've had Ike present before, and he's a fountain of knowledge, as are you, and it's great because this stuff does have impact on a lot of people in the audio industry in varying areas, certainly in theater and in live musical performance, but in broadcast as well, and beyond. So a lot of application here, a lot of applicability, and a lot of relevance. So it's
can be done. As I say, we're doing 48 channel Phantom of the Opera was 24 channels, but that was in 89. There was a lot of channels. But and then we had several productions I coordinated, world tours, including Celine Dion's world tour. There was 50, 60 freaks back in 92. In those days. And so that's kind of average now for a production. And so a 48 channel system is still feasible. We're doing it on Broadway as we speak. Again, just with adjacent theaters, and you've got a first in, first out type law or rule. I mean, it's a gentleman's agreement on Broadway. Is whoever's first into that particular theater. So like Lion King was using our gear, for instance, they're in there first. They plot their freaks, and then they have a theater literally across the street, or even an adjacent theater that moves in. They have to talk to the two audio A1s and the frequency coordinators talk to each other and work it out. I can't stress enough, we're all in the same boat. The more we all share and teach, the better we'll be as an industry.
Well, yeah, there's a recurring theme here of cooperation, right? As opposed to competition, which is a really good thing to see. And I think, that's something for humanity to be aware of and be conscious of and hold on to.
Cooperation and no compensation.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's been 2 years now. It's been more than 2 years since COVID became a factor. And yeah, no compensation has certainly been a reality for a lot of people in entertainment and in other industries. And let us hope and pray that we move in the opposite direction and get back to some kind of normal as quickly.
Absolutely, yeah. We wish everybody busy season, and we're here to help. Yeah.
Well, I thank you very much on behalf of our section and on behalf of myself. I've really enjoyed our chat, enjoyed meeting you, and you too. I hope we can meet up in person sometime. And I live pretty close to you. I'm in the shadow of the El Macambo.
Oh, there you go. Oh,
yeah.
Well, you're literally down the street.
Yeah, indeed. So I hope we can meet up in person sometime.
Yeah, let's do that, Ross. Thank you.
Hopefully at an AES meeting.
We look forward to Ryerson again eventually, right?
Yeah, so absolutely.
We got to keep it going.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much, Colin.
You too. Thank you. Bye.
For more information on the Toronto Audio Engineering Society, go to torontoaes.org. There you will find notifications on our upcoming events, past events, Masters of Audio, and our member showcase. The Toronto AES is brought to you by Solotech, Gare Audio, Sonotechnique, Bell Media, YSL Pro, Lectrosonics Canada, BRTB, Global USS, Adamson, Lawo, avshop.ca, Q5X, and the executive team of the Toronto Audio Engineering Society.